when a black ICU nurse showed up to court in her scrubs after a 12-hour shift. The judge called her out in front of everyone, but what she said back left the entire room on its feet. Angela Whitman stood in the back of courtroom 3B, still in her pale blue scrubs. Her sneakers were worn from pacing the ICU floor all night, and her ponytail was half slumped to one side. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about what she saw last night, the panic in a patient's eyes, the rushed code call, and that final beep when the clot finally broke loose. It was a few minutes past 9. The room was packed. Lawyers shuffled papers. A few jurors whispered. Some folks glanced at her and then looked away. She noticed people always notice when a black woman shows up in the wrong space. Wearing the wrong thing, Angela moved toward the witness stand quietly, her badge still clipped to her pocket. No time to change, no time to think. She hadn't slept in 18 hours, but she was here because truth doesn't wait. Then a voice boomed from the bench. "Miss Whitman," said Judge Ronald Pritchard without even looking up from his monitor. "Is that what you consider appropriate attire for my courtroom?" Heads turned. The air shifted. A few people leaned forward in their seats. Angela stopped mid-step. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "I came straight from my shift. I didn't want to be late." Judge Pritchard finally looked up, his eyebrows raised, his tone sharpened. "This is a courtroom, not a hospital. You're here to testify, not to work in ER. Show some respect." There it was, loud, public, intentional. Angela could feel it, not just the embarrassment, but that old burn of being called out, not for who you are, but for how you don't fit someone else's picture of what's appropriate. She inhaled slow and deep, then took another step forward. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, steady. "I've just come from helping save the life of a stroke patient who arrived with 5 minutes to spare. My scrubs aren't disrespectful. They represent every person I've fought to keep alive, some of whom ended up here in this courthouse because people gave up on them." Silence. A bailiff looked over at the judge, unsure whether to step in. An older man in the back crossed his arms and leaned back, watching. You could almost hear the shuffling stop. Angela continued, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't need volume. Her words cut clean. "I'm not here to make a statement with my clothes. I'm here because someone in that hospital was neglected, and the truth matters more than what I'm wearing." For a few seconds, no one moved, not even the judge. Then came the sound that no one expected, a single pair of hands clapping. Then another, and another. Within seconds, half the room was on their feet, not in protest, just in response to something real, something honest. Angela didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just took her seat at the witness stand and waited, eyes fixed ahead. Judge Pritchard glanced down, adjusted his robe, took a sip of water he didn't need. The bailiff didn't say a word. But behind Angela's composure was a story no one in that room knew not yet, and it was time to understand how much those scrubs had already seen. 12 hours earlier, Angela Whitman was leaning over a stretcher at UAB Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, her fingers pressing hard against a man's wrists, trying to find a pulse that was slipping away. "Clot in the left hemisphere," the attending had shouted. "Page Neurology." "Stat." Angela didn't flinch. She grabbed the crash cart with one hand and the patient's chart with the other. His name was Jerry, 61. Arrived incoherent, drooling. Half his face collapsed like wet paper. He was lucky someone found him in time, but luck doesn't last on its own. You need people who care. "BP's dropping," Angela called out, adjusting the IV. "We need to move now." She was 3 hours into her shift when Jerry came in. That was 9 hours ago. The night had been a blur of alarms, blood draws, a code blue in room 12B, and a grieving mother crumpling to the floor at 4 a.m. "Ma!" It was like that most nights, barely time to eat, definitely no time to sit. But that morning, something in Angela refused to clock out. She had gotten the court summons 2 weeks earlier. A patient had come in after a fall at a nursing home. The bruises didn't match the story. Angela noticed. She documented everything. Her report was what triggered the investigation. Now she had to testify not for herself, but for the woman who couldn't. Angela pulled off her gloves and washed her hands until the water turned cold. She checked the board. Jerry was stable. Neurology had taken over. Her body wanted to collapse, but the clock said 7:52. More. If she left now, she could barely make it. She ran a quick comb through her hair in the break room mirror, wiped a smear of antiseptic from her sleeve, and grabbed her tote bag. No time for makeup, no time for real shoes, and no time to iron anything. She threw on her hoodie, stuffed her ID into her pocket, and headed for the staff elevator. A fellow nurse, Cassie, was brewing coffee. "You okay?" she asked. Angela gave a tired half smile. "Court. Neglect case. Like that woman from 8C. Cassie nodded. "Go get 'em," she said. "Make it count." The walk to the parking garage felt longer than usual. Her legs were heavy, her shoulders slumped forward without her realizing. At the crosswalk, she saw herself in the glass window of the outpatient wing. tired, older than 34, and in a uniform that felt less like clothing and more like armor. Traffic was light. She hit every green light. It felt like the city was letting her pass, not knowing what was at stake. When she pulled into the courthouse parking lot, she stared at the building for a long second. Concrete, tall, glass windows, American flags stiff in the wind. It looked sterile, familiar in a different way. She took a breath and stepped out. No change of clothes, no moment to reset, just her and what the night had left behind. The ache in her knees, the faint smell of iodine, and the knowledge that she did not show up empty-handed. Her testimony wasn't going to be dramatic, just facts. Truth laid out clean, but her presence, her scrubs, would speak first. And she knew that. She hoped it wouldn't be a problem, but the courtroom didn't hope with her. The judge's reaction wasn't just about protocol, it was personal, and it had history behind it. And that history was about to show its face. Angela sat upright in the witness chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The murmur of applause had faded, but the energy it left behind hadn't disappeared. People were watching differently now, some with respect, some with quiet embarrassment, others with curiosity, wondering what else this woman was about to say. Judge Ronald Pritchard hadn't spoken since the applause broke out. His gavel remained untouched. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, then tried to reassert control. This courtroom, he began slowly, will maintain order and professionalism. Regardless of applause, his voice didn't echo like before. Something had shifted. Angela kept her eyes on him, calm but alert. The prosecuting attorney, Bethany Quinn, stood and walked toward the center. Her heels tapped softly across the floor. She nodded toward Angela, not with sympathy, but with quiet acknowledgement. "Miss Whitman," she said, "can you tell the court what you saw the night of April 3rd? Angela didn't hesitate. "I was assigned to the ER. The patient, Miss Loretta Daniels, came in from Restview Senior Care, transferred by ambulance. She had a broken hip and multiple contusions, arms, ribs, temple." She paused, letting the image settle in everyone's mind. Her vitals were unstable, blood pressure low. She was dehydrated. She hadn't been turned in her bed in a while. You could tell her skin had pressure sores along her back and elbows. "Stage 2, maybe stage 3? I've seen this before." I knew what it meant. Bethany nodded. "And what did you do next?" I asked the medics what they were told when they picked her up. They said the nurse on duty claimed she fell while trying to get up on her own. Angela looked straight ahead, her voice unwavering. But Mrs. Daniels was non-verbal. She had advanced dementia. She couldn't walk. She couldn't stand. A soft gasp came from someone in the gallery. Angela kept going. "I asked the medics to document their findings. I called my supervisor and asked to file an internal report. I stayed late that night to speak with the charge nurse and begin a formal incident record." Bethany glanced at the jury. "Did you believe the nursing home staff were telling the truth?"
"No,"
Angela said plainly. And neither did the paramedics. A ripple of silence moved across the courtroom. The defense attorney, a man named Grant Bellamy, stood and raised his hand. "Objection. Speculation." Judge Pritchard hesitated. "Sustained," he said quietly, almost as if he regretted saying it. Angela didn't flinch. She had said what needed to be said. Bethany pressed on. "Miss Whitman, why did you stay late that night?" Angela turned to the jury now, because Loretta Daniels didn't have anyone else. No family showed up, no friend, just me and the 2 medics. And I didn't want to go home without putting something down in writing. I couldn't. That sentence landed like a stone. Grant shifted in his seat. Bethany returned to the table, flipping through her notes. Though she barely looked at them, Angela looked toward Judge Pritchard. "I didn't come here for applause," she said gently. "And I didn't come here to be praised for doing what should be normal. I just want people to stop pretending that what happened to Mrs. Daniels was anything short of wrong." The room held its breath again. The jury, 12 strangers pulled from across Jefferson County, seemed more alert now, more human. Pritchard adjusted his glasses. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he leaned back and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. Angela had shifted the air twice now. Not by raising her voice, not by tearing anyone down, but by telling the truth without apology. But as the judge sat in silence, something in his expression suggested this wasn't the first time he'd been challenged. And maybe that's what bothered him most. Ronald Pritchard had been on the bench for nearly 22 years. Before that, he'd spent a decade as a prosecutor. Before that, 6 years in the Marine Corps. Discipline, order, protocol that was the world he came from. You spoke when spoken to. You dressed by the rules. You followed the chain of command. And if you didn't, you were out of line. He was born in 1961 in Meridian, Mississippi, the middle son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher. His father was the kind of man who shined his shoes before going to the grocery store. If Ronald came to the table without tucking in his shirt, dinner was over before it began. As a young man, he learned that respect wasn't just expected, it had to be shown first, visibly, in the way you spoke, the way you looked, the way you dressed. So when Angela Whitman walked into his courtroom in hospital scrubs, he didn't see a nurse who had just worked all night. He saw a challenge to everything he'd been raised to believe about what dignity looked like. But what Judge Pritchard didn't know was what those scrubs meant to her, or what it took for her to wear them through that courtroom door without shame. He also didn't know that, years ago, his own wife, Nadine, had been rushed to an ER with heart palpitations. He never got the nurse's name, but she stayed 2 hours past her shift to monitor her. He told that story once at a dinner party, praising the young lady who really gave a damn, but he never considered what she might have been wearing. Now, as he looked at Angela, seated on the witness stand, composed, deliberate, tired but unmoved, something gnawed at him. He remembered his time in the Marines, how corpsmen in bloodied fatigues worked through the night without complaint. He never questioned their uniforms, he respected their grit. So why now was he picking apart someone who clearly lived her life on the same battlefield, just in different colours? He shifted in his chair. Angela hadn't said another word since the last question. She sat quietly, hands still folded, not fidgeting, not breaking eye contact, no smugness, no smirk, just presence. It reminded him of something he had once told a clerk who showed up late and dishevelled. People notice everything. If you don't control how you show up, they'll write your story before you even open your mouth. But Angela had opened her mouth, and she'd rewritten the room's story. Pride is a hard thing to loosen, especially when it's baked in by decades of being right. His clerk, Nathan Greer, leaned toward him and whispered, "You okay?" Pritchard gave a tight nod, more to end the conversation than to answer it, because deep down, something about this moment wasn't sitting right. He didn't feel disrespected, he felt caught, like the sharpness of his own words had exposed more about him than her. And there it was again, that image of the ER nurse who once helped his wife, a woman with tired eyes, calloused hands, and a quiet kind of urgency that didn't need applause. Angela reminded him of her. He hadn't thought about that night in years, but now he couldn't stop. And still, she hadn't moved. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't pleading. She had simply walked in, told the truth, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. Judge Pritchard looked down at the bench, then back at her. He cleared his throat again, but this time his voice was softer. "Miss Whitman, thank you for your testimony." Angela simply nodded once, respectfully, no smugness, just gratitude. But what Angela didn't know yet was that her presence hadn't just challenged a room. It had shaken a man who thought he knew everything about respect. Bethany Quinn stood again, giving Angela a brief look, part gratitude, part encouragement. She turned to the jury. "No further questions." "Your Honour." Judge Pritchard gave a nod, more controlled now, as if he'd regained a piece of his usual rhythm. The defence attorney, Grant Bellamy, rose from his chair with a faint sigh, tugging at his cuffs, as if preparing for a routine dental cleaning. He approached the witness stand slowly, flashing the kind of grin Angela had seen a dozen times before. Polite, dismissive, and just a little too certain. "Miss Whitman," he said, pausing to fold his hands theatrically. "You're clearly passionate about your work, but would you agree that passion doesn't always equal accuracy?" Angela blinked once. "I believe passion can keep people honest. I also believe it doesn't replace facts." Grant nodded, the grin still there. "You've been a nurse for how long?" "Almost 10 years. And in that time, have you ever made a mistake on a chart?" Angela leaned forward slightly. "Of course, every professional has, but not when it comes to a woman who can't speak for herself and ends up with a broken hip and bruises from a care facility." A couple of jurors tilted their heads at that. Grant pressed on. "You said the patient was non-verbal, so how can you be certain that her injuries weren't the result of an accident?" Angela didn't look away. "Because I've worked with dementia patients for years. Loretta Daniels had limited mobility. She was bedbound. The bruises on her arms suggested she was grabbed, pulled. The hip fracture wasn't from a fall, it was a forced break. You're not a forensic expert, are you?" "No," Angela replied, "but I know the human body when it's hurt by carelessness." Grant shifted gears. "So your opinion is based on instinct?" "No," she said. "It's based on patterns, experience. You see enough of something, it stops being an accident and starts looking like a choice." There it was again, that room-wide pause that followed every time Angela spoke, without trying to impress anyone. Grant stepped back. He tapped his pen against the table. "No further questions." Angela was excused. She stepped down, quiet and steady, as she returned to her seat behind Bethany. Several eyes followed her, not just because of what she'd said, but because of the way she said it. The next 2 witnesses were called, but the temperature in the courtroom had changed. Testimonies came and went, but Angela's words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. 2 days later, closing arguments wrapped. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. When they returned with a verdict, the courtroom was packed again. Guilty negligence and abuse confirmed. The representative from Restview Senior Care slumped in his chair. The nursing supervisor, who had been on duty the night Loretta was injured, barely looked up. Angela wasn't in the room for the verdict. She had gone back to work another stroke patient. Another set of charts. Another woman in room 14A who reminded her of someone else. Bethany called her that evening. They found them guilty, she said. Angela didn't cheer. She didn't breathe a sigh of relief. She just said, "Good." There was a pause. "You changed the case, Angela," Bethany added. "Your testimony, people listened." Angela smiled faintly. Then it was worth the scrubs. But what Angela didn't expect was how that one courtroom appearance would follow her back into her world. Not with criticism, but with quiet gratitude from strangers who had simply been watching. 3 days after the verdict, Angela was back on the 4th floor of UAB Hospital, charting vitals and fielding a chaotic mix of IV alarms and a diabetic patient who wouldn't stop trying to pull out his line. The courtroom already felt distant, like a weird, surreal episode she'd stepped into and then quietly walked away from. She hadn't told anyone at work about the moment with the judge. If they saw it on the news, no one said a word, but something had shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in how the world outside started seeing her. It started with a message on her work phone, a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Whitman, this is Deborah Chambers. I'm Judge Pritchard's clerk. He asked me to reach out. He'd like to speak with you privately, if you're open to it." Angela read the message twice, unsure if she wanted to answer at all. She didn't respond right away, not out of anger, but because she didn't see the point. What would he say? Sorry. That wouldn't be enough. And honestly, she didn't need it. But the next morning, a different kind of encounter found her. A woman, mid-50s, grey-streaked curls, holding a folded denim jacket, was waiting by the elevators. Angela had just ended a double shift. Her eyes stung from the brightness of the hallway lights. "Excuse me," the woman said quietly. "Are you Angela Whitman?" Angela blinked, her hand still on the elevator button. "Yes, I didn't want to bother you. I was in the courtroom last week. I was sitting in the back. I wasn't part of the case. I just came for a different hearing. But I stayed when I heard what you said." Angela tilted her head, unsure where this was going. The woman took a breath. 3 months ago, my son collapsed at home. Heart condition we didn't know he had. He was brought here. I don't remember much, but I remember there was a nurse who stayed with him. She wore blue scrubs and had her hair pulled back the same way. Angela froze. Her breath caught. "You were that nurse," the woman said. "I remember your voice." Angela's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. The woman stepped closer. "I never got to thank you, but hearing you speak in that courtroom, it made me realize you're not just saving lives, you're forcing people to see it. And that matters." Angela finally managed to speak. "How's your son?" "Good," the woman said, smiling through misty eyes. "He's starting school again next week." They stood there in the hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, neither of them needing to say much more. Angela made it to her car that morning and sat for a while, with her head against the steering wheel, not crying, just tired. But this time, the tiredness felt worth something. Later that week, she finally called Deborah Chambers back. They met in a quiet side room at the courthouse. Judge Pritchard entered with a folder in one hand and a coffee in the other. He didn't waste time. "I came from a world where respect looked a certain way," he said, not quite sitting down yet. "I thought I understood what it meant, but I watched that courtroom stand up for you, and I realized maybe I was wrong." Angela didn't say anything, just waited. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," he added, "but I did, and I owe you an apology that doesn't hide behind courtroom language." Angela nodded once. "Thank you." He looked relieved that she didn't make it more complicated. "I've been a judge a long time," he said, "but I think I just learned more in 15 minutes than I have in 15 years. Angela gave a small smile. "Well, I've had worse shifts." He laughed at that and then quietly left. But the conversation didn't end there. Not in Angela's life, and not in the lives of the people who saw something they couldn't forget. Angela didn't become famous. She didn't go viral. There were no book deals or interviews on morning TV, and that was fine with her. She didn't need a spotlight, just enough light to be seen. A week after the case ended, a young nursing student named Marisol stopped her in the hospital cafeteria. She looked barely 20, still carrying a thick textbook, and wearing the kind of oversized hoodie you only take off when you're absolutely forced to. "Miss Whitman," she asked cautiously. Angela looked up from her tray. "Yes, I just wanted to say, I was in the courtroom too. My cousin was part of another case that day. I didn't mean to sit in yours. I just stayed because..." She trailed off, nervous. "You made me think about why I'm even doing this." Angela motioned for her to sit. "You ever question it?" Marisol nodded. "A lot." Angela shrugged. Good. The day you stop questioning it is the day you stop doing it right. They talked for 10 minutes about patience, burnout, school, how people see nurses as background noise until they need them, and then expect them to be heroes without ever being human. As Marisol stood to leave, she turned back. Thank you for not changing before court. Angela smiled. Didn't have time. No, Marisol said softly. That's what made it matter. Moments like that didn't come every day. But when they did, they stuck not like awards or titles, more like scars that remind you why you kept going when you were exhausted and no one said thank you. Angela went back to work the next day, and the one after that night shifts. Blood pressure drops, tears behind privacy curtains. Sometimes she'd catch someone staring at her ID badge a little longer. Sometimes a visitor would stop and say, "You were in that case, weren't you?" And she'd just nod quietly. She never traded in the scrubs for something safer. She still walked into rooms with dried saline on her sleeves. She still pressed fingers to fading pulses. Still listened to stories patients whispered at 3 a.m. when they thought no one else cared. But she carried herself differently now, not louder, just more certain. One evening, while chatting at the nurses' station, Cassie leaned over and said, "You know you scared the hell out of that judge." Angela chuckled. "He needed it. You think he'll ever forget it?" Angela thought about that. "I hope not." Some stories aren't about spectacle. They're about quiet revolutions, the kind that happen when one person refuses to shrink. When one woman shows up exactly as she is, unpolished, unbent, and unashamed. Angela didn't have to raise her voice. She just had to speak with the same clarity she used when calling out a heart rhythm steady, direct, and with no room for doubt. Respect doesn't come from clothes or titles or how long you've been in the room. It comes from how you carry the weight no one else wants to lift. And Angela had carried it for years, the patience, the reports, the impossible nights. She didn't need applause to keep going. She just needed to know someone was listening. So the next time someone questions how a nurse looks, or walks, or speaks, maybe they'll remember that courtroom, that silence, that clap. Maybe they'll remember Angela Whitman and think twice, because sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that speaks last, without yelling, and still manages to change everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, a nurse, a caregiver, or just someone who never gets the credit they deserve, take a second to hit the subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Angela's happen every day, and they deserve to be seen.